that house. And so when it came time for me to go to college and they weren't giving me enough financial aid and my mom had to figure out a way to finance my education at Tulane University in 1986, she went down to the bank and got a loan for $10,000. But how do you do that? Because banks are not in the habit of giving money to broke people. Nothing in it for them. So what they do, they gave the money to my mother because my mother took her mother down, who used her home as collateral against the loan. She co-signed the loan so we could get the 10 grand so I could go to college. It's a home she wouldn't have had she not been white, because her husband couldn't have gotten it had he not been white. And so quite literally, this arc of privilege extending all the way back to the 1600s, extending into the present, is responsible for why I'm standing in front of you today. And I tell you all of this not out of guilt, because as I said earlier, there's a profound difference between guilt and responsibility. The question is simply, how do we respond to the recognition of unjust advantage? Whether we're white folks doing that over race, whether it's men doing that over gender and the history of sexism, whatever the dynamic is, those of us who are members of any dominant group, and most of us are members of at least one, if not several, whether it's on the basis of race or gender or sexuality or income or just being physically able-bodied, vis-a-vis people with disabilities. Most every single one of us has some identity where we are the quote-unquote norm, where we are the quote-unquote dominant group. And the question is, in those moments, how do we respond to the recognition of unjust advantage? How do we take personal responsibility? Personal responsibility being a phrase that white America likes to use against black and brown America like a bludgeon. As in, when are you going to take personal responsibility for your stuff and stop blaming the system and stop pointing at white folks? But when are, I ask, white folks going to take personal responsibility for the unearned advantages that bring us to the point where we can even preach and lecture to others in the first place about that subject? Because if we are going to expect those who operate at a disadvantage, whether it is racial, economic, in terms of disability status, sexuality, religion status, whatever the non-dominant, marginalized group might be, if we expect those who are operating against barriers to nonetheless put forth maximum effort, and of course we do, then those who are the dominant group, those with the disproportionate power, must also have something expected from them, from us. It is a two-way street. It is a multi-directional avenue. Personal responsibility is not something which the dominant group can preach to everyone else and then ignore the fact that if we're pointing at others, we're not pointing at ourselves and thus not taking personal responsibility at all. But it's easy to ignore this, especially in this so-called age of Obama, where the assumption is that we don't have to talk about this anymore. The age of Oprah, where she's so rich, personally, she could take every one of us, capture us, and just give us out to her audience members as a parting gift on Friday afternoons. And we'd pretty much be helpless to stop her. That's a powerful woman. And the president is a powerful man. But the assumption that too many make is that somehow this age of Obama, this age of Oprah, this post-racial era really is that. That somehow the presence of a handful of people of color in top positions signifies the death of racism as a systemic truth. But before I present you with the evidence to indicate how absurd that is, let's just think about the logic of it. If I were to say to you that women and girls in Pakistan no longer face obstacles on the basis of their gender identity, and this I know because Benazir Bhutto won the presidency of that place not once but twice, a woman, you would think I had lost my mind. To suggest that sexism as a systemic truth in Pakistan had been eradicated, that patriarchal oppression of women had been destroyed because a woman happened to become the head of state there, or in India, or in Israel, or in Great Britain, do we really believe that? No, because we know that individual accomplishment says absolutely nothing in and of itself about larger systemic truth. How do we know that? We know that Madam C.J. Walker was the first both black and female millionaire in American history, but we also know that she became a millionaire in what year? 1911, which on balance was not a real good year to be black in the United States of America. So the fact that this one individual African-American woman could overcome all the odds and all the obstacles to become a millionaire said nothing about the larger truth that average everyday black and brown folks were experiencing. No one in their right mind would have said in 1912, Well, now Madam CJ made it, so what in the world is the matter with all the rest of them? Because individual accomplishment doesn't say anything about systemic truth. Here's the systemic truth in 2009. The systemic truth that will be written in no newspaper. The systemic truth that will be taught on no media outlet. The systemic truth that will be mentioned by no presidential candidate, least of all the presidential candidate of color. Because he, above all else, will not be able to say any of this. He would not have been able to say anything I've said thus far. And what I've said thus far isn't even open to argument. You think that President Barack Obama, now the most powerful man on the face of the planet, arguably, could actually acknowledge that the history of this country was a formal system of white supremacy? He couldn't say any of that if he wants to continue to have a political career. I mean, he could say it. Surely he knows it. But he, more than anyone, is constrained from saying it. That's just how not post-racial we are. That's just how you know that this president's administration that's not black power, that's not brown power, that's white power. That he's there, unable to speak truth about these things which really aren't even open to interpretation. So here's the systemic truth, 2009. The average white family in this country, I do not mean by that the average rich white family. I mean the average white family right in the middle has 11 times the net worth. 11 times the net worth of the average African-American family, 8 times the net worth of the average Latino family. It is not because we worked harder. It's not because we prayed harder. It is not because we saved our money more wisely. And God knows it is not because we as white folks possess some superior investment knowledge about which black and brown people are somehow clueless. If we have learned nothing else from the last 18 months of global economic meltdown, let us at least take away from it this. A handful of rich white men are capable of losing a hell of a lot of money without any help from black people, without any help from Mexicans, without any help from people of color whatsoever. Trillions of dollars in global wealth literally wiped off the balance sheets of the world economy, all of it before Barack Obama and his family walked into their new house. A handful, we won't even bring all white folks into this because it wasn't all white folks. A handful of rich white men, supposedly more competent than everybody, supposedly more intelligent than everybody, playing with an economic tool known as a derivative, which they wouldn't even be able to explain to you if their life depended on it. But they were selling them. It's like playing Texas Hold'em in a fraternity basement. Only the difference is, in the fraternity basement, it's your money. And with derivatives on Wall Street, it's somebody else's money. And then when you lose all of it, oops. I wasn't as smart as I told you I was. Oops. I wasn't as brilliant as everyone thought I was. Still, even with that, even with this handful of rich, white, incompetent, unethical, venal, and criminal white men who have wiped off these trillions of dollars from the global balance sheets, we are still more afraid of a young black man crossing the street in a hoodie than we are these rich white men driving around in their Lexuses, or maybe the word is Lexi. I don't know the proper plural form. But whether it is one or the other, make no mistake, it is not those of whom we are afraid. We are afraid of the usual suspects, because why? We inherit the legacy of that system that has taught us to fear some and not others, even though it would take 500 years for black and brown street thugs to steal as much money as this handful of rich white men have taken in a matter of 18 months. 500 years, half a millennium, robbing you around the clock, 24 hours a day, not taking a break to sleep, not taking a break to eat, not taking a break to use the bathroom, around the clock, hand in your pocket, constantly robbing you. But that's not changed who we fear. That 11-to-1 wealth advantage for white folks versus black folks, that 8-to-1 wealth advantage for white folks versus Latino folk, is because of government intervention. Make no mistake. And remember that when so many white Americans tell us, so many of my people in the narrowest sense of the term, tell us that government never did anything for us. No. No, we got it all on our own. We did it all on our own. We did it all by ourselves. Never gave us anything except the 270 million free acres of land under the Homestead Act. Except that. Except the $120 billion worth of home equity loaned to whites preferentially under the FHA and the VA home loan programs from the 30s to the 1960s when black and brown folks were excluded from the policy. Government underwritten. You understand there would be no white middle class without the government of the United States intervening on behalf of white working class people and providing housing guaranteed loans that otherwise banks were not going to lend, you see. The white middle class did not come about because of hard work in a vacuum. It came about because of a combination of hard work, which most people do every day, and access to an opportunity structure, which not everyone had. But folks will tell you, of course, government has never done anything for them. The systemic truth, black men with a college degree right now losing their jobs in this recession at twice the rate of comparable white men. What's interesting is, I know it's rough for everyone. Make no mistake, I understand. White folks are scared, ought to be scared. The economy's in free fall, and it's in free fall for pretty much everybody. But now here's what's fascinating to me. See, double-digit unemployment is not new for everybody. Double-digit unemployment is only new for some people who had gotten comfortable, who had a mentality of entitlement and expectation that said, in every generation, things will be better for our children than they were for us, and better for us than they were for our parents. But for black and brown folks, that was never taken for granted. The idea that anxiety and stress and uncertainty is a new thing, not that I'm not sympathetic. Anxiety and stress is stressful, and it's unconscionable that we have an economy that allows this level of insecurity for anybody, of any race, of any ethnicity, of any socioeconomic background. But the point is, you see, privilege sometimes makes you soft. Privilege sometimes leaves you ill-prepared for change, and change is inevitable. So for the people who have been marginalized for generations, they are the ones, not the dominant group. They are the ones who have the coping skills to actually get through hard times, and the rest of us are freaking out like the world is coming. This is why after 9/11, see, after 9/11, a lot of white folks were getting on air. I was watching them on television saying, why do they hate us? Why? Why? I didn't see any black people ask that question. I didn't see any brown people ask that question. And it's not because people of color were less sympathetic to the dead. My God, people of color disproportionately died. You had service workers, black and brown, down there at the site. They were the ones who were hit probably disproportionately hard when you really add it up. So it wasn't about lack of sympathy or lack of patriotism, whatever that's supposed to mean. It wasn't a lack of human decency, but it was a sense that for black and brown folk, terrorism is not new. And for people of color, the idea of knowing what it is to be hated is not new. And to be a person of color is to have to know what other people think about you, because if you don't know, your life is in danger. But only the privileged group, the dominant group, had the luxury of living in a tortoise shell for generations where we kept our head down and we didn't pay attention. And then when something happened, our world, and now I mean our psychological world, blew apart. See, privilege is pretty unhealthy. There's a reason why the dominant group ought to rethink this thing. Because privilege leaves you soft, but it certainly does exist. More evidence. Study from MIT and the University of Chicago 4 years ago finds what? That job applicants with white-sounding names, 50% more likely to get called back than applicants with quote-unquote black-sounding names, even when all the credentials are the same, all the years of experience the same, the level of education the same, the quality of education the same, the grades achieved at college the same. The only difference, the names at the top. Barack Obama, as candidate, couldn't talk about that. 2 to 4 million cases of housing discrimination a year against people of color, according to 7 or 8 private studies in the last decade to decade and a half. And according to government data, 2 to 4 million times a year, people of color may be getting a mortgage, but getting it at a higher interest rate, being steered to subprime loans, even though their credit would have qualified them had they been white for a regular loan. And this ends up costing what? Literally billions of dollars in lost assets and equity for black and brown peoples. Think about what black and brown communities could have done with those billions of dollars in lost assets that they had to not save and keep, but had to fork over to the bank in the form of higher interest. See, that devastates entire communities. And that just doesn't hurt black and brown folks. That hurts the whole economy. But see, what was interesting was when the subprime thing was only hitting people of color, nobody seemed to care. When they started doing subprime junk loans in the 1980s, this started. And early 1990s, and people were writing books about it, and community organizations that had been much maligned and mischaracterized like Acorn were talking about it. Nobody wanted to listen. Nobody wanted to listen, although they were right. They were not trying to get people loans that they couldn't afford. Acorn actually tries to get loans for people that they can afford. It's the banks, it's the independent mortgage brokers who were almost entirely unregulated, who were able to shovel loans to people that weren't really able to make those payments. It was a form of reverse redlining. Old redlining said we're not going to lend anything in this community. Right? Reverse redlining says, oh, we're going to lend lots of things in this community. We're going to make it where you can't really afford to make the payment because we don't care, because by the time you default, we will have sold the loan 3 times. We will have made our money. We don't really care what happens to you. That is systemic racism and systemic classism. We know that according to a study in the American Journal of Public Health, and probably 24 additional studies in the last 10 to 15 years, that the consequences, the health consequences of racial discrimination for African American peoples, and now there are some studies that find similar results for Asian Americans and Latinos, but this particular study found that the health consequences for black folk alone of discrimination, I don't even mean the blatant stuff, I mean the subtle stuff. I mean what experts call microaggressions, the look, the comment, the statement that you're not really sure whether that was about race or not. Was that about race? I wonder what that was. Was that about race? I wonder what that was. That actually creates not just anxiety and stress, but it has a direct effect on hypertension, has a direct effect on heart disease. This particular study found that the consequences for black folks of dealing with discrimination in the present era, not 2 and 3 generations ago, but right now, are equal to the health consequences of smoking, equal to the health consequences of not exercising, equal to the health consequences of eating a high-fat diet. Now, in the case of bad diet, lack of exercise, and smoking, we as a country have defined all those things as public health crises, every one of them. But now discrimination and racism, according to the evidence, having the same consequence. We have never once suggested that racism should be dealt with as a public health crisis, not ever. Partly because the dominant group has never seen the problem, and this is the challenge for us. It's a challenge for any dominant group. And so for those who are men in the audience, even if men of color, we got to think about this as men, all of us, with regard to the issue of sexism and the oppression of women, right? For those who have a little bit of money, we got to think about this with regard to working class and lower income folks. For those who are straight, we got to think about this with regard to our LGBT brothers and sisters. For those who are able-bodied, we have to think about this with regard to those who face the discrimination that often the disabled face, because the dominant group is almost always in denial. That's the privilege of being the dominant group. The dominant group doesn't have to know black and brown truth, does it? We really don't. The only reason I even begin to know any of it is because of the incredible mentors, mostly of color, who I had in the city of New Orleans when I worked as a community organizer in public housing in that city. Most of the folks who really taught me were people with average educations of maybe 10th or 11th grade, but they knew more about racism than anybody with a PhD, white, black, or otherwise, who ever taught me in college, right? And so I learned to listen to those folk because they were the best authority about their own life. But that's not how we're raised to think. Dominant group members are raised to think that we know better. So even in the early 1960s, at a time when this country was operating a formal apartheid system, 70% of white folks in 1963 told the Gallup poll that they thought black folks were treated equally in this country. 1963, y'all, that's the year of the March on Washington. So what that means is, by our own admission, like 7 out of 10 white people are watching the news that night that Dr. King gives the I Have a Dream speech. And 7 out of 10 white folks are looking at the news going, I don't get it. Why are you dreaming? Why? Everything's good, right? Like, this is America. Everything's fine, right? Right? because the dominant group could go to sleep. 1962, 87% of white folks told Gallup that black children had equal educational opportunity with white children. 87%, that's like 9 out of 10 in 1962. Now, there are only two possible explanations for that level of delusion. A, white people are really heartless, uncaring people. There are people like that in every group, but that cannot possibly explain 9 out of 10. Can't. The only other possibility is what? That white folks, being a member of a dominant group in that society, both then and now, didn't have to know any better. Because it wasn't going to be on the test, was it? I mean, if white folks didn't know the deal, were they going to suffer any penalty? Would we now? If white folks don't know what people of color experience, what happens to us? Nothing. If people of color don't know what white folks deem important, all hell breaks loose. Because that will be on the test. That'll actually be the test. So people of color will have to learn white literature and white art, white poetry, white theater, white drama. And I realize we don't call it that, but that sort of be the point. See, when your stuff is the norm, when your stuff is the stuff against which everybody else has their stuff compared, you don't have to racially designate the origin. You don't have to call it white literature. You just get to call it literature, theater, poetry, art. For those who are still confused about this, and I'm not expecting there'll be too many in this audience, but I'll just throw it out there anyway. This is why we don't have White History Month. Because we have several. They just go by these tricky names that we've given them, like May, June, July, August, September. But that's the point. See, the dominant group doesn't ever have to process any of that. So really what this struggle against racism and the struggle against sexism, the struggle against any ism requires is that dominant group members let go of the sense that we know other people's reality better than they know their reality. And every one of us in here can use that advice, whether it's on a racial level, a gender level, a level of class or sexuality or physical ability, because like I said, just about everywhere I go, anyone in the room is going to have at least some dominant status, and we have to think about how we're going to exercise that responsibly as opposed to irresponsibly. But then the question becomes, why would you? And I understand that. Why would a dominant group member want change? Why would I stand here as a white man constructed as such in this society and want to end white supremacy? After all, it does provide perks, it does provide benefits, it does provide advantages. Well, in addition to what I said before about how it can make you soft and it can leave you without the coping skills that you need for a downturn, which I think is a real serious deal and worthy of consideration, let me add one more to that. And see, this is important because this isn't just business, this is personal. And sometimes you don't realize how personal it is until it sneaks up and bites you on the behind at the moment you didn't expect. So a couple of years ago, and I'll close with this story as I started with one. A couple of years ago, my wife and our daughters and myself, we were sitting around the living room on a Sunday afternoon. It was raining out, and we couldn't really do anything, couldn't go to the park, didn't have anything to do. About 2 or 3 o'clock, we decided we'd watch a movie on the on-demand cable satellite deal, you know, pay $4.95 or whatever it is, and you order up a movie. So we're thinking we'll do that. We start flipping around, looking at trailers, looking at commercials to see what's on that might be good for families. We're not finding very much. Then we come across the trailer for the movie Evan Almighty, right? Now, this is a film you may have either seen or saw the commercials for it, right, where this congressman, played by Steve Carell, is told by God, played by Morgan Freeman, that a flood is coming and he should build a really big boat and ride it out. You have probably heard this story told in another setting, in another context. This would be the modern retelling of the Noah and the Ark story. And it's a fairly cute movie. All right, my family had already seen it when I was out of town, so they didn't want to see it again. But because my children, who at that time were 6 and 4, they're now 8 and 6, they were 6 and 4 at the time. Because they had seen the film, when they saw the trailer, it got their attention because they recognized it, you know? So my youngest daughter looks up. She sees Morgan Freeman in the role of God in the flowing white robes, and she looks at me and she says what a 4-year-old would say, which is, Daddy, is that really God? Because that's exactly what you would say it for. You don't know anything about the Screen Actors Guild at 4. You don't know anything about casting directors at the age of 4. You just figure God had nothing else to do but make a movie. So she asked it very sincerely, very open. And I laughed and I said, no, honey, that's an actor. His name is Morgan Freeman. He just plays God often. You'll probably see him. You'll probably see him in this role again, a couple times before he's done. And I thought that'd be the end of the conversation, right? I mean, I really did. But then the older daughter, who was 2 years older, 6, and with whom I had had definitely more conversations about race at that point, just because she was older, so chronologically I'd had more time to do it. She looks up, because now she's wondering what we're talking about. And she sees Morgan Freeman, and she looks at her sister, and she laughs, and she says, Rachel, that can't be God. Now, I knew in this moment 2 things. One, that I was going to have to ask her why not. And then secondly, that I already knew before I asked her what her answer was going to be. I looked across the room to my wife, looking for some assistance. I got nothing. In fact, she looked across the room back at me, also knowing what was about to transpire, with this look that said, okay, smartass. This would be your area of expertise. So good luck with all that. I looked at my daughter and I asked her, why? Why can't that be God? Now, in the nanosecond before she answered, because it didn't take long, in the nanosecond before she answered me, I had this fantasy, it's like an out-of-body experience, that she was gonna come up with some really brilliant answer that I hadn't expected. Like, that can't be God because God is a woman. That would have been cool with me. I would have been fine with that answer. Or she would have some existentialist answer like, God, what is God anyway? Some deep thing like that. But she was 6, so that would have been asking a little bit. So instead, she gave me exactly what I expected she would, and she said, because God isn't black. Now, I don't think it will surprise you to learn that in our home, there are no physical representations of a God which would give the impression that that God was the equivalent of Santa Claus in the sky. There are no racialized images of deity or divinity to be found anywhere in our house. We do not allow children's Bible story picture books that would give one the impression, were one weak-minded and did not know better, that Adam and Eve had resided in the Garden of Sweden. We don't have any. We don't have any of that kind of imagery represented in our home. But she picked it up somewhere, you see. We didn't teach it. We didn't give her that. We didn't damage her that way, but something did, and somebody did, and the books she can see in the library did, and the books she can see in the bookstores did, and the Christmas cards that relatives and friends send us every single December with a Europeanized image of Jesus on it certainly tells her that that conclusion she reached makes perfect sense. Make no mistake, if you were to break into my house and try to hurt my children, I would kill you. And I'm not saying that because I'm all big and bad or that I'm violent. I'm not. I'm not a violent person, but I'm also not a pacifist when it comes to protecting my family. So if you were to try to break, I don't have a gun, but I'll find something. And I will hit you with it. And you will die. I mean, that's it. If you were to break into my house to try to harm my children, that's what would happen. But listen, here's the point. Something is breaking into my house. Something is breaking in and the doors are locked. And the